This story is about flying, so what better way to enjoy it than to sit back and admire the scenery. First, the place where it all began, near Hokitika. Hard to believe it, but what we take for granted now, a scheduled licensed air service, began right here. In this paddock, history was made for the West Coast and history was made for New Zealand. Air Travel New Zealand Limited was established in 1934 and first used the tiny de Havilland Fox Moths. The service was the dream of one man, Captain Bert Mercer. In the 1920s, the nation was eager for adventure. You could take a flutter at Addington, or was it Riccarton? Or you could gamble on the roads, motoring to the west coast. Of course, there was a lot to see and do around Hokitika. But if you wanted to go further south, that's where Captain Mercer came in. On the 18th of December 1934, Captain Mercer flew New Zealand's first licensed and scheduled flight from Hokitika to Franz Josef.
I can quite remember the first time he flew me up the Franz Josef. I was scared because the plane, it just feels like you could go out and you could touch the sides of the mountains, but because in those days that was the Fox Moth, and passenger was in front and Dad was behind. He had his face through the little wee hole, beaming all over.
It was a terrific thing, the aeroplane, especially in the deeper south, you know, the Haast and Akura, that area in particular, but from a scenic point of view, it just made Fox and Franz Josef because people that couldn't walk on the glacier could do a flight. And
the Fox Moths were later joined by other aircraft, Dragons, Rapides, and the aircraft that proved itself the real workhorse of the coast, the Dominie. Dominie is always recalled with affection by old pilots.
Very, very stable aeroplane. One day I flew all the way from Haast to Hokitika without touching the control column. I just give a little bit of rudder occasionally to bring up a wing. Just as a matter of an experiment to see if you could do it. And it did. It just sat there.
The greatest aeroplane that's ever been built, man. No, they were great. They're a real workhorse. Like I've flown the Fox Moth, the Dragonfly, but of the lot, the Dominie is the machine. Stay up on one motor, which the others didn't. Carry a good payload. Not such a smaller field as you'd get the Dragon in and out of, but quite a bit faster. A good all-round aeroplane.
60 years after Captain Mercer's flight to Franz Josef, a Fox Moth and a Dominie reenacted the journey. People who live at Friends are now well served by helicopters and ski planes, but the original aircraft are still fondly remembered. Franz Joseph Glacier in the 1930s was the jewel in Bert Mercer's crown.
That was one of my father's delights, was to whiz up in the plane and do a circuit of the aeroplane, of the hotel, 6 o'clock in the morning or 6:30, get the people down. They come down on flocks, all for their flights.
Further south, in places like Bruce Bay and Haast, there were fewer tourists, but the aeroplane made a huge impact on those who lived in remote places.
Mercer and Hewitt and these early men, they loved to throw a paper out at these beachcombers, people along the beaches and so forth, and I think most people who lived in South Western can tell a lovely tale about how the plane had flown over and tossed a paper out, and some say it went down the chimney, but whether it goes that far, I don't know.
We used to take hot bread down. Eastgate's a big bread shop in Hokitika, and used to go over and get cases of bread sometimes and put it in the plane, and they get hot bread for lunch.
The pilots that went on their own, they done outside of Hokitika, they done their own loading, they done their own refuelling. They even had to swing their own propellers. So they were everything.
For 33 years, the biplanes flew up and down the coast. There were several changes in the ownership of the firms, NAC, West Coast Airways and so on, but those biplanes flew the tourists in, and they flew out.
Whitebait, I got sick of the sight of it in the end.
On the west coast of New Zealand's South Island, whitebaiting is a profitable and popular pastime in the early spring. It's in the far south that the big hauls are made. In the forest streams far beyond the end of the road, the fish are netted in large quantities. To keep them alive, they're put into holding tanks sunk into flowing water. Here they're kept up to 36 hours before being packed in boxes and taken out by pack train. In these inaccessible parts, this is the only way to get the fish out, across unbridged streams and through winding bush tracks to the road and the waiting lorries. To get his catch to town, an outback farmer is sending it in with the timber lorry. Small planes come to the remote landing fields to take on a load of whitebait. They fly daily over the hump of the Southern Alps to the inland towns of the South Island. Along all the rivers, the west coasters continue to reap their spring harvest. Tomorrow, boat and train and plane will again be ready to take whitebait to dinner tables all over New Zealand.
The flying days of the Dominies were numbered as the tar seal below stretched further and further south. When the road to Haast was opened, the amount of freight flown dropped dramatically. In March 1967, pilot Brian Waugh flew the last scheduled flight by West Coast Airways. "60 years after air travel began, other aircraft, old and new, queued up to pay tribute to the biplanes. At a pageant in Hokitika, historic and modern aircraft took to the sky to mark the town's place in history. place in the show was reserved for the biplanes which started it all off. Still flying, not as numerous as they once were, and kept just for the pure joy of flying. And for refreshing, happy memories.
Ladies and gentlemen, as organiser of the Air Service anniversary, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this celebration dinner which commemorates the historic South Westland Air Service 1934 to 1967. I think we'd all say it's been a tremendous day with a marvellous air pageant. There are some aircraft still flying, and everyone, especially the younger ones who went for a ride today in a DC-3 or a Dominie, will long remember this day. I had the privilege of helping to get Doug Lister, Jock McLernan and Des Holden squashed into a Fox Moth cabin, and they all said that they preferred to be in the cockpit. They all flew the Fox Moth during the late 40s with NAC.
Nobody has actually mentioned Air Force pets or air travel pets. There was one very conspicuous small dog by the name of Toby. Originally belonged to the Renton family. He caught the flying bug quite early in his career and used to hop aboard the Fox Moth any time he saw the door open, and he'd arrive at Fox or Haast or Waiho and get out again. And he used to come and stay with us when he wanted to spell in our house, which was the closest to the aerodrome in those days. So he commuted between Waiho and Hokitika. He did quite a few miles. Stories are told of him on a rough day, bouncing from the seat to the ceiling and back again. Anyway, just a few thoughts of how air travel brightened the lives of us in South Westland. Thank you very much.
I think October of that year, 1934, a little girl up the Turnbull, we're far enough from the Wop Wops at Okura, but that's another 12 kilometres or so up and across a river. And she took very ill. There was a northerly storm blowing and the rivers were raging floods, and so the parents got on to Sister Gunn at Wataroa, who confirmed it most likely was appendix, and they tried to get on to Captain Mercer, but he was back in Christchurch. It was just when he was running that sort of as required service. So many other pilots would have done it, I suppose. He flew to Invercargill, and from there he flew up and landed in our Nolan airstrip paddock, and my dad met the Harrises around there who had to bring the girl and her mother over by boat and away to hospital to Dr. Wilson's, and where the taxi was waiting, and had her on an operating table in about an hour and saved her life. Well, that was one of the several lives that he most definitely saved.
The real master of those flights was the weather. The pilots were marvellous and they'd take on anything, but occasionally the weather would win. When it came to my flights, I generally got poor weather, cloudy, raining or something, about 70% of the time. In fact, it was usually so poor that the locals at Haast called it Dr. Jean's weather, and they wouldn't book to fly out on my days. I suppose one of the worst flights we ever had was when there was a gorge blowing one day down the Haast River, an easterly that stirs up half a mile of shingle, and we couldn't fly out from Cron's little airstrip, so we had to take off from Muscle Point, which is more or less a collection of rabbit holes and sand. Frank Malloy was pilot, so I didn't have any worries about it. There were 4 of us on the Fox Moth, all knee to knee, and we had a priest on board, and he said, "You've got to hang on, you've got to make sure you're all tied down." So we had hand halts and foot halts, and we were all generally packed in tight. And we took off, and really we had a rough flight. We were bounced all around the sky, and sometimes 100 feet this way and 50 the other. And I thought, oh well, it's not so bad. At least we got the priest, and he should be quite happy about meeting eternity. But after about an hour or half an hour, the weather cooled off a bit, and we got in the lee of the land, and the easterly wasn't so bad, and we landed in at Fox and at Franz. So we all piled out because the engineer had to check the petrol supplies. And the first person to make a suggestion was the priest, and he said, "How about a medicinal brandy up at the Franz?"
Sometimes, when the weather was bad, I'd picture the Dominie battling along, so insignificant, against the mountains and over the bush and over the rivers and the sea at the side, dwarfed by the terrain. I remember and miss the pilot talk, the stories of awkward passengers, the humorous incidents, the present financial state of the company worked for, the discussions over the latest accident, wherever it had happened, always with the question, could the pilot be blamed? There's a certain glamour, mystique, associated with pilots and flying. Even though my husband Brian used to say flying was 99% boredom and 1% sheer terror.
We'd love to drop in at Haast and have a chat and a cup of tea with Mrs. Cron and her daughter Myrtle. Myrtle was Air Travel's agent at Haast. But time is caught up. So instead, we'll show you some of the other highlights of flying on the coast. The first is courtesy of National Archives and is from a film still talked about in South Westland.
Servicing the west coast of the South Island for nearly 30 years, the scheduled aircraft from Hokitika to Haast is a regular and familiar sight over settlements along the thinly populated coastline. coast flying, when roads were few and often impassable, the scheduled planes would land in farm paddocks and on sea beaches as part of a near personal service. Although more and more roads are being pushed through to link the scattered townships, there'll always be a place in the hearts of the coasters for these pilots who came early and were always there when needed.
Captain Mercer, mechanic, pilot and flying instructor, the founder of regular air services on the West Coast. It was the West Coasters learning to fly in Christchurch who first attracted Bert Mercer to the coast.
Well, when he was at the Canterbury Aero Club, Jack Renton wanted to learn to fly, and Dad taught Jack Renton. And I think it was Jack Renton and his family could see perhaps there would be an opening. And that's how I think it all started.
Captain Mercer quickly became a friend of people living in the remote parts of the coast. He was demanding of his pilots, but had an intriguing way of recruiting ground staff.
I went to school and called into the headmaster's office, and of course, and he said, oh, they want a boy over at air travel. So this was about 9:15 for the time I was told, on the bike and bike over. And I got over there about 9:45, and by the time I found Mr. Mercer and was told his name was Captain Mercer, approached him and said I'd been told by the headmaster to go over. And I said, I'm just going to Nelson. He said, I'll see you when I get back. So anyway, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he wasn't back, and Andy Drummond in the office said, oh, you better go home, he's gone to Wellington. And I said, no, he told me he would see me. So anyway, he didn't get back till about 6 o'clock, and when he landed I helped him put the plane away, and he said, aren't you the lad that I talked to this morning? He said, yes. Why are you still here? I said, well, you told me you'd see me on the way back when you got back. And you've been here all day? Yes. He said, start at 8 o'clock in the morning.
A cousin worked there, and I'd been looking for a job. I'd only just turned 15, and I was looking for a job, and the cousin worked there, and he said, Bert's looking for someone to take, I think it was a bloke called Bill Little's place he'd left, and this was on a Saturday, he told me, so I hopped on my bike and I went over, and I struck him working at the bench there, and I asked him, and he asked me a few questions, not very important ones really, and just asked if you were mechanically minded and things, and I must have gave the right answers. He said, all right, we'll start on Monday. And that was it.
One of the de Havilland Dragons purchased by Air Travel was this one. It had served cities such as Napier and Gisborne in the past. As a passenger in 1944, Captain Mercer was on board the Dragon returning home from Wellington.
I really couldn't believe it, because Dad rang from Wellington that morning to say he would be home. Tell your mother, pack a bag, we're going for a holiday. Well, I'll see you at 3:30 or whatever. And our wireless operator, Gordon Bowman, we were in touch, with the phone in the office and that, and I said to Bo, what time did the plane leave Nelson? 1:05, direct. So I said, right, well that'd be about 2 in Westport, roughly. Oh, well, 2 o'clock come and 2:30 come, and I rang through and I said, any sign of the plane? He said, no. So I waited until about 3 o'clock and I said, any word of the plane? And he said, no. I said, right, get your act together. Called their planes on, they were way down south. And by that time, of course, it was winter time, of course things were getting dark. And I suppose it'd be about 8 o'clock at night when we got word.
Parts of the aircraft in the trees still remind us of the crash in which 2 people died. Remarkably, 5 others survived.
the prayer of dedication of this plaque. Eternal God, giver of life, we stand before you to mark the 50th anniversary since the crash of the Dragon airliner ZK-AHT, and especially to remember and give thanks for the lives of Bert Mercer and Morris Dorr. We dedicate this plaque and memorial as a fitting tribute to the events of the 30th of June 1944. May this be a special place for all those who will stop here on their travels. This we pray through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Captain Mercer was injured in the crash, but he identified the site, then died just an hour before help arrived. The other passenger who died here was the company secretary, Morris Dorr. AEK and ADI were the first two aircraft in air travel's fleet. ZK AEK was called the Royal Fox Moth.
It was originally built for the Prince of Wales, and he, I understand, used to, he didn't fly himself, but the King's seat, as you see, is up the front there, and he used to fly around England in it. And then it was brought out here, and it was used, as you know, on the west coast here, and by Bert Mercer.
Oh, that was a real buzz for Hokitika. Yeah. Oh, yes, the Prince of Wales plane, you know. It got the name Prince of Wales plane, and then we just called it the Fox Moth in the end. Yeah.
The old people that have been having rides in the last few days have been saying, gosh, the ones that we went in were nothing like this inside. You know, it's really plush, as you can see. It's beautiful.
In October 1943, 4 members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force climbed on board for a 15-minute scenic flight. A short time after that photograph was taken, another was taken. The plane had crashed at 5,000 feet on the glacier. Fortunately, the injuries were slight, but it took a rescue party about 10 hours to reach the group. Captain Mercer decided the Fox Moth was too valuable to be left on the glacier, so the recovery began.
Well, it was his pride and joy, the aeroplane. In the workshop where we used to do the refuelling, there was a newspaper cutting stuck on the wall on a chunk of plywood or something, and it was telling you how a little tin pot airline and way over in New Zealand beat everyone else to get the Duke of, or the Prince of Wales it was, to get his aeroplane, and beat everyone else to the draw. And there was a little article pinned up on the wall there, so it probably had a real soft spot for him.
Across pinnacles and crevasses, the Fox Moth made an undignified retreat from the glacier. The entire aircraft was recovered except for an engine cowling, which took 6.5 years to come down with the ice. Remarkably, that same aircraft, ZK-AEK, now 62 years old, is still flying.
We learned when men drove them, the pilots, they said, would wear leather helmets strapped onto their heads. There were cockpits and joysticks and rudders and wings, all words that we learned about aeroplane things. It's fun to go flying if you'll only try. Just fasten your seatbelt and take to the sky. And while you are up there, just take a look down at the lakes and the rivers, the mountain and town. Med McGregor and Parry and Nanskivel too, together with Renton were the men who then flew. The Spartan, the Avro and then Tiger Moth, held tightly together with strong canvas cloth. Then along came Bert Mercer and his air travel team. Isolation in Westland was then just a dream. The Fox Moth Dominie with the old dragonfly brought life to South Westland from out of the sky. It's fun to go flying if you'll only try. Just fasten your seatbelt and take to the sky. And while you are up there, just take a look down at the lakes and the rivers, the mountains and town. Mechanics and admin, all part of Bert's team, kept our flying doctor, the good Dr. Jean, in touch with South Westland along with the mail, the freight and folks travelling through rain and through hail. Almost 10 years have since now passed by, our big jet and jib trail we trace across the sky, and hundreds of people inside eating lunch, with pretty girls serving out liquor or punch. So it's fun to go flying if you'll only try. Just fasten your seatbelts and take to the sky. And while you are up there, just take a look down at the lakes and the rivers, the mountains and town.